Good morning and welcome to today's session on transforming the Latin American energy landscape. We have a group of esteemed panelists here, and we're going to talk about the implications of the changing markets and technology, the energy system's resilience to climate change and extreme weather, and to really have a Davos-style discussion about the opportunities for regional cooperation. Climate Scope, which ranks nations in terms of their ability to attract foreign investment in energy, ranked 4 countries in Latin America and the region among the top 10 worldwide. Last year, LATAM received over $10 billion in foreign direct investment in clean energy. This defies the traditional wisdom that energy countries had to rely solely on fossil fuels because they could not afford clean energy. Our first panelist, and for starters, I'd like to apologize. Andrew Brown's had some flight issues, and he's on his way here. The head of Shell for Colombia and Central America will be stepping in for now, but so we've changed the format a little bit because he should be here before the panel's over. So first, we'll start with our esteemed colleague, Francesco Starace, who is the CEO of Enel. Francesco has held several positions in Enel, from from being the CEO of Enel Power to their renewable and generation subsidiary and a leading player in the global renewables industry. Prior to that, he had international experience living in the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Bulgaria. In 2015, he was appointed to the board of the directors of the United Nations Global Compact, and since 2014, he's also a member of the advisory board of the United Nations Sustainable Energy for All Initiative. In 2016, he was appointed co-chair of the World Economic Forum Energy's Utility and Energy's Technology Community. With that, Nell, you would like to make a couple of comments?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for this introduction. I just want to outline a little bit how we see from our standpoint the evolution of the markets here in Latin America. We have a very global position. Latin America is one of the areas of the world where we are active. We are a big utility worldwide. And I can tell you it's a great place, it's a great time to be an investor and a utility in Latin America nowadays. This is an area of the world that, from the standpoint of an energy company, is a fantastic opportunity. Yes, there has been some contraction in the economic activity due to the commodity cycle. But overall, if you take a period between 2008 to now, you can argue that Latin America has basically managed better than many other parts of the world the whole cycle. And on top of that, you can also say that global demand, energy demand in Latin America, it is of course driven by the economic activity, but also by a very powerful and strong demographic push, which on the long haul is the only real guarantee for sustained power and energy demand. That said, on top of that, you can add that this is a part of the world that is blessed with an incredible amount of potential in terms of renewable energy sources and also, of course, conventional energy sources. You have in Latin America a combination of hydro, wind, solar, geothermal, biomass resource that is one of the largest and less utilized potentials in the world. So if you combine these two things, you see there is a view that demand will remain sustained for a long time. There is a huge potential to supply with. And in between, of course, you need to have the infrastructure that puts together these two things. And the infrastructure need of Latin America does not only cover generation, but also covers transmission and distribution, the whole value chain of our activity. I have a point here that every time we talk about these issues, we end up talking 80% of the times about generating energy and 20% of the time about distributing and transmitting energy. And I think it's wrong. And I think Latin America has a great chance to avoid this mistake that was made in many other parts of the world. So we argue that it is a great potential. We think it's a great place to be. You also have a combination of political and institutional issues and problems, like most of the part of the world, but certainly this is not an area where you live with geopolitical tensions of the order of magnitude that other parts of the world experience. And we can also say this is a part of the world where there is some good news that are of some big impact. And this is, for example, something that has to do with Argentina. It's a great moment, and it's actually, I was telling my colleague here, 3 years ago, if one would ask me that, do you think that there would be a WEF conference in Buenos Aires? I would say, it's impossible. I don't think it's possible at all. Now it's a dream coming true. So it is a great time, and we think there is a lot of work to be done and a lot of mistakes that can be avoided, provided the governments of Latin America pay attention to the energy evolution of the energy sector as it is happening globally.
Thank you. And in your experience, how are the new technologies revolutionizing the energy sector? Enel was one of the first utilities to replace conventional electromechanical meters with so-called smart meters.
Yeah. Well, I think we all experience in our life that's a lot of technology thrown at all the things we manage and that are around ourselves. This is happening in an unseen way to all the energy sector. It's happening in generation. Why are renewables so hot? Because technology has made them cheap, and it's still pushing them at cheaper and cheaper levels. The levels of competitive pricing that solar and wind farms have reached in the last tenders in Latin America show that they are absolutely at par, if not better than conventional sources, and they are in a way a very good option to play with, and that's technology, and that's not finished, it is going on. And then on top of that, the whole digital transformation that is occurring to our infrastructure hits in a very large way the distribution sector. Distribution is the less developed and in many ways the less remembered part of the value chain, but it is the one that really reaches consumers. It's the one that really goes into the factories, offices, and homes. And the change that digital devices and digital intelligence into the network is incredible in terms of efficiency, in terms of performances, and in terms of additional services that customers can have if they have a digitized network. This is a place of the world where countries can just jump into the digital world, avoiding the agony that we had to go through in Europe. So this is a big potential for all the countries in Latin America. Just go there, leapfrog all the rest of the transformation that took so long in Europe. And for us, I think it's one of the major advantages that we see in this region.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Marcos Bulgheroni. He's the Executive Vice Chairman and member of the board of Bridas Corporation. He's also a board member and the Vice President of Commercial Development of Pan American Energy. Marcos is part of the Bulgheroni family, which is the owners of the largest local petroleum business in Argentina. Since 2010, they have expanded throughout the Southern Cone and have signed joint ventures with the government to develop Vaca Muerta and the shale gas reserves in Argentina. So from a different perspective, Marcos, it would be helpful for you to give us comments as to where you see the regions going.
Okay. So I thought I've complement Dr. Starace's view on energy by giving you an idea of where the oil and gas markets are going. So we are experiencing over the last couple of years a cyclical downturn that happens ever so often in the oil price. And this is no different, or actually it's very similar to what happened in 1986, the oil crisis in 1986, because it had a lot of the same elements. So as in 1986, this oil crisis is product of oversupply, of new reserves discovery, In '86, it was the offshore. In this case, is the unconventional revolution. And it also, as in '86, this crisis has an interesting element of how OPEC reacted to this crisis. We are seeing today that OPEC is, to some extent, redefining its role in the market, and that has implications as to how much it acts in the market in order to sustain or leave the price to go through. And what we're seeing essentially over the past couple of months, the last 6 months, is that OPEC has taken the view that they will not put in quotas and therefore not put in a price. And that is a different way they see themselves getting and acted into the market, and mainly because of the shale revolution. The second market that is also undergoing a lot of change is the gas market. And I see two elements that are very important in how the gas market has changed and will change, how the dynamics of the gas market will change going forward. One is the challenge of the gas pricing mechanism. Up until now, generally speaking, gas prices were priced based on oil index and oil products indexing. That has been challenged in many places of the world, including Latin America. Less so in Latin America, more so in Europe, for example. And that is a very important aspect because that means that the gas price is going to be determined more by market demand and supply forces and not necessarily by the oil price. That is certainly something that we will see going forward, and we are seeing the beginning of that happening in Latin America. We have Henry Hub in the US, we have the MPV and other markets, regional markets in Europe, and that is a very important element. The second element is the arrival of LNG as a way to connect the different regional markets of gas. I mean, gas by its nature, because there was limited by pipeline capacity and by the oceans, had a regional price dynamic determined by politics, costs, so on and so forth. LNG is the link that allows the gas molecule to travel across those limitations and eventually making, over the course of time, prices converge. Different regional prices converge eventually to a more global market. I mean, this is still in the beginning, but is a trend that we see certainly happening. So how are the companies adapting or reacting to this cyclical downturn in the oil market? Basically, there's three elements that I see in common throughout Latin America and the world, and one, I would say, specific objective in these three elements. So the most obvious, and I think the biggest impact, is the decline, let's say the decrease in capex and deployment of investment throughout the region. We have seen, for example, in Latin America, investment in the sector decreased by about 28% between 2015 and 2014. And rig count, which is a measure of activity, a very important measure of activity, decreased by about 50% in Latin America. Of course, these are trends that hopefully will change, but until now we've seen that. We also see a redefinition of the different equilibriums between the different stakeholders in all the different producing regions. And by that I mean new equilibriums are being set between government, provincial governments, federal governments, operating companies, service companies, suppliers, and of course the trade unions. And within this discussion, there's always the same tension between, of course, social peace, equilibrium between the different communities, fiscal issues, so on and so forth. So throughout the region, we're seeing these new equilibriums being reached from an industry that had a lot of money to an industry that now has to share a lot of less money around. And the third thing is the impact on technology. We all have heard about the impact on the unconventional shale oil, shale gas. That certainly has changed the market forever. But there are other technologies such as oil sands and offshore that have also deep water pre-salt resources that have also changed the nature of how technology is applied in the operation. So finally, we get to the question: where is the price going to be in the next years? Because that's a typical question that everyone wants to hear. And my uncle used to tell me that there are two types of people who talk about the oil price, two types of analysts, and there's people who get lucky and people who are wrong. So essentially, I think we all have to live with the notion that nobody knows where the oil price is going to go, but there are certain underlying technical fundamentals that allow us to at least get some idea of how the midterm is going to go. So essentially, big picture trends, all production declines naturally, and we're seeing that the declining rates are increasing over time. So oil is declining, and consumption increases. Oil demand decreases, albeit at a lower rate, but it increases, mainly pushed by emerging markets. That gives us basically a gap at a certain point in time, because we see that every 5 years, the world market needs about 9 million barrels a day to replace existing reserves and production. 9 million barrels a day, just to give you an idea, is the total production of Latin America. Okay, so we need one Latin America production every 5 years, and that means a lot of projects that need to come on stream. Of course, the new projects we're finding are more expensive, more technically difficult, and therefore need a higher price. So the consensus that the industry has is that to reach this new 9 million barrels in the next 5 years, we need prices. We're going to start touching on more expensive and difficult projects that come on stream, and therefore we need prices to go in between $60 and $70 between now and 3-5 years. So that's it.
Thank you for being bold and making a prediction.
Well, this is a consensus. This is not what I'm saying.
This is the general consensus. Our next panelist is Renat Heuberger, who is a social entrepreneur in the field of sustainability, climate change, and renewable energies, which he has been engaged in since 1999. He holds a master's degree in environmental science from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology and completed the social entrepreneur program. After working for development organization Swiss Contact in Indonesia, he co-funded the World Student Community on Sustainable Development and the Platform for Interdisciplinary Projects and Seed Sustainability. He is a social entrepreneur from the Schwab Foundation and specializing in new technologies for the region. So now, having heard from the renewable and the oil and gas side, it would be interesting to see your perspective on the climate change and technology side.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Let's first have a short look at the challenge we're having here ahead of us. Latin America is growing fast. The prospects are really promising, with a lot of change happening in many countries like Argentina, Colombia, and so on, as we know. Predictions are that the demand for energy in Latin America will double by 2030 and will triple by 2050. Okay, the energy mix is 70% fossil fuels. That's less intense than the rest of the world, but still, it's a heavy dependence. At the same time, climate change is causing some serious problems, and we start feeling it, right? Here in Colombia, for instance, we had this El Niño phenomenon last year. Combined with climate change, this led to serious droughts and actually hydropower being stations running dry partially. So even now we see the challenge. Historically, the world has emitted 1,500 gigatons of CO2 since industrialization began. If we want to limit the temperature by 2 degrees, we have 1,000 gigatons left to emit, not more. If we continue the way we are doing now, we are actually going to emit 1,700 gigatons until 2050, and we're on track for a 6 degrees target. That's not going to be a lot of fun anywhere in the world, also not in Latin America. So we have to do something very radical. And we're talking about the reduction of 60% of the of CO2 intensity. That's massive, okay? But here's the good news. The prices of renewables, especially solar, has collapsed over the past years. Between 2011 and 2015, every year, the prices come down by 15%. So in many places of the world, especially here in Latin America, with a lot of sun, I mean, some of these countries here are the most sunny in the world, solar power now is at grid parity. You're actually spending not more on solar than on conventional energies. Yet there is also another challenge out there, which is that 34 million people in Latin America don't even have access to electricity at all, right? And many of these poor families depend on cheap energy, subsidized conventional energy. So we have to keep that in mind when doing new policies, new action. It's not only energy sustainability; it's also an energy equity question. So now, given that challenge and given the opportunity, you may now wonder: so why are we sitting here in this conference and why is not the boom happening everywhere? And I think, and we'll certainly discuss it on the panel, there's a few important barriers which we have to be aware of. One of them is access to finance. Still, as you know, renewables, they are requiring more upfront costs and less OPEX costs later on. So we need new financial products to finance them. They're not really abundantly available so far. Another issue is subsidies. Across Latin America, 2.3% of tax revenues is still spent on fossil fuel subsidies. It's a lot of money. Of course, it depends. Different countries have different roles. Venezuela is very high and Colombia is actually zero. But still, it's a lot of money still there. Legal issues. IRENA, a renewable energy NGO, counted no less than 325 different support schemes for renewables across the continent. Think about that. An investor like Enel or Enel can certainly handle that, but for smaller players, handling 325 different laws, subsidies, feed-in tariffs, auctions, tax exemptions, it's difficult, right? So you have to be able to navigate that. So a bit more of harmony would be certainly very good. To sum up, I think now we have two serious drivers here to ensure that the energy landscape will look very different in a few years from now. The most important one certainly being the Paris Agreement that has been included, the Paris Agreement on climate change. The interesting thing about Paris is that every nation, and I'm talking about every nation in the world, it's really pretty astonishing, has now committed to do a contribution towards reducing carbon. This means that in Latin America, I think every country except for one now have a renewable energy target or legislation. So that's interesting. Again, at the moment, this still leads to a lot of policies, but I'm quite sure that with more lessons learned, there's going to be harmonization, and countries will learn from the mistakes and the success stories from others. So that's going to improve. The second driver, interestingly, is actually a corporate driver. A lot of companies, big multinational companies, have embarked on a renewable energy target. They say, I want to go globally 100% renewable. And sort of for the first time, instead of only, let's say, a government push, you also have a corporate pull, which I find interesting. So there's a new type of demand for renewables coming out. So I think, summing up, it's fair to say the transformation of the energy landscape in Latin America is most likely going to be the biggest business opportunity that you have ever seen happening in Latin America. Stay tuned, it's going to be an exciting journey.
Thank you. Let me just ask you a question. From your perspective, what do you think are the three most important things from the public and private side to establish that sustainability, climate change, efficiency of technology and energy sector in the region? Because one of the things that Dr. Francesco said was, one of the interesting things about Latin America is the ability to go from where it is today to, leapfrog into the future and skip that development part, which I think is very interesting perspective. So from your perspective, what do you think?
I think the most important thing is to again reconsider the role of government and the role of private players. The role of government, very obviously, is to set the rules and to set them in a transparent, stable way. In Europe, for instance, we had issues around feed-in tariffs, which then were basically retroactively revoked because some European governments were kind of run out of money. And this is the worst thing you can do to an investor. So what investors in this field need is stability, predictability, to ensure that your investments are actually, turning the returns if expected. The second thing, Francesco was mentioning it, is actually a grid connection and transportation. It's a topic which is most often underestimated. In Chile, for example, there's 2 grids which are not connected. This leads to a situation where one grid is oversupplied and the other one is not oversupplied. In the oversupplied grid, it can happen to you that power prices go to zero. It happened in 2016 in, I think, about half of the days. Imagine you have a solar power station in that grid. That's pretty bad news. So obviously, there needs to be more connection, and so that this power which is coming through renewables, and we all know the sun sometimes shines, sometimes not, wind sometimes blows, sometimes not. This power needs to be distributed. So that's the second big challenge. And maybe the third one I would like to mention is inclusion. As a social entrepreneur, of course, many of my peers work with people in underprivileged areas, and access to energy, access to basic things like light in the evening, cooking and so on is very, very important. So when doing that transformation, we have to do it in an inclusive way. And let's not forget renewables being decentralized by nature. If the distribution topic is solved, are actually very powerful to empower local communities. So it leads back to the second point, but once again, sustainability, reliability, but also energy equity are important to go hand in hand.
And Marcos and Francesco, would you care to comment from the private sector? What are the barriers that you see, towards this regional collaboration and achieving these goals on a regional basis?
Yeah, I think there are several things, but of course 1 or 2 or 3 more important than others. So I would try and focus on those that I think are really material. And the first one is, I think, what we observe not only in Latin America, but in many other places around the world, which is basically this cult of volatility as a virtue and short-termism as a way to approach problems. And that is always a mistake, and it is increasingly so. So I think regulators and government should work hard at establish efficient, long-term energy markets as the only rational way to really drive investments across the area. And so that's number one recommendation. I think that many parts of Latin America are good at this, others a little bit behind. And I think the more this diversification between areas stays, the more you will see flows of investment going in one area and less going in the others. So that's number one recommendation. Try to avoid short-term markets, go long-term, because that's the only rational way in which people will finally decide to invest. And second is remove incentivation from all kind of energy sources, be they fossil fuel, be they renewables. Incentivation is always a mistake. It always fires back. There's always a problem on the way or later, and it is always a complication. We think it's a mistake, we should go away. And I think Latin America is one of the less incentivized areas of the world. It is messy, but it's not as messy as elsewhere. So we should stop here and stop incentivizing any kind of energy source. Just let the market play. And finally, the third recommendation is about transmission and distribution interconnectivity. I think here, Latin America will do the same pattern, will follow the same pattern that we've seen elsewhere in the world. Transmission lines, high voltage transmission lines, will be slow in adapting to changes on technology. Typically, they are slow for various reasons. We don't want to discuss this here. The slowness of response of transmission lines has always one only consequence, that investors go down and they work at medium voltage and low voltage. So the push goes into the distribution area that has to supply and fix the problems at transmission level. And in order for distribution companies to be ready for that inevitable, evident transformation, they need to digitize. So companies that digitize their distribution network are ready for the inevitable filling in of the space that transmission companies will leave. Okay, that's the third recommendation. Push digital systems, push digital transformation of networks, because it's a no-brainer. It's a cost-saving exercise, and it prepares you for when transmission lines will not be able to cope. And investors will break down big projects into smaller ones and go at low voltage. So that's the thing to do, these three things. Stop short-termism, go long-term. Avoid incentivations, and if it's there, just don't think it's going to last, because it's never going to last. And third, prepare, digitize the distribution network. Transmission operators will have to struggle their way through harmonizing the rules and interconnecting between themselves, and that's the most difficult thing of all, everywhere in the world.
Thank you very much.
Well, I think a lot has been said, so there's very little I can add, but if I can give my 2 cents, and building along what he mentioned on the importance of trying to get away from these cycles of booms and busts that we see as a cyclical constant in the region, is at the end of the day, it seems it's very a consequence of these cycles is that in between cycles we have to actually live through a very dramatic transition, be it a crisis or be it difficulty for the country politically as well as from a business point of view, adapt to the new reality. So key to that is a lot of dialogue between the public and the private sector. I know it sounds obvious, but it's always good to remind ourselves that we do need to foster and deepen that dialogue. A lot of times there is mistrust between both sides for different reasons. And the only way we can bridge that is by executing this plan, implementing this plan of constant dialogue. We've lived through it, or I've lived through it personally, in which due to the old markets, the transition between high prices to low prices was worked through in an exercise of bringing all the stakeholders, all the different groups that are affected by this change. And it was a difficult process. We had to work through the issues and take into account things that for us as business people are not obvious, but for politicians are important, or for trade unions are important. And insofar as we can bridge that gap through dialogue, I believe that we'll successfully find solutions to these transitions. But the best way to avoid it is to actually not have this cyclicals, or to bring down the volatility. And the second short thing that I would comment is that if we manage to focus, again, as a long-term policy on energy integration within the region, I think we have a lot to gain. We, in Latin America, particularly the Southern Cone, are very well integrated, or let's say there's been a lot of work done towards integrating the Southern Cone. There's a vast network of pipelines covering Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, Bolivia, having molecules travel back and forth. There's also interconnection in the grid between all these countries. And as I said before, there's this new kid in the block, which is LNG, and there's almost 5 or 7 regas facilities and 2 under construction that supply about 18% of the gas consumption. So all these things are important because it builds towards integrating the energy sector within the region, and then brings energy security, that brings flexibility, and a much better and faster way to adapt to the changes in the market.
Thank you. And now for our esteemed panelist, Andrew Brown. Andrew has been the Upstream Director at Royal Dutch Shell since the beginning of the year. Prior to that, he was the Executive Vice President at Qatar Operations and the Managing Director of Pearl GTL and Country Chairman of Qatar at Royal Dutch Shell PLC. He personally oversaw the successful delivery of the $18 billion pioneering Pearl GTL gas-to-liquid project as the managing director. In 2012, he was awarded the Order of the British Empire, a new honors list for his services to British-Qatari business relations, and he's also a member of the Nigerian President's Honor Investor Cycle. From your perspective, could you add a couple of words to?
Well, thank you, and sorry I'm late. I was kind of 5 hours circling. There was some fog at the airport, and what a beautiful country. I just saw it time and time and time again. And it's fantastic. My first visit to Colombia. Look, so I just say a few words about, Shell in Latin America. We've been here for over a century, 80 years here in Colombia. And we've had a bit of a transformation in acquisitions we've made recently, both with BG and the Repsol LNG assets, that have really made Latin America, a really core part of our future. Brazil will be in the top 3 of the countries for Shell across the world. This is a region I don't have a lot of experience with because, as described, since January, I've taken on the global role for Upstream and Shell. But I think if I look at Latin America, a lot of progress has been made in the last 20 years in terms of particularly access to energy. But 96% of people now get access to electricity, 20% more than 20 years ago. And this issue about access to affordable energy is core to development, is core to economic progress. And I guess we all face the challenge, how are we going to provide more energy with less CO2? And that is, just a gigantic challenge for all of us. And in this region where energy growth is quite significant, probably 50% increase of energy over the next 20 years. So the pace in which energy has to be provided in order to keep the economies going and the people basically with basic needs and of a modern world is a big problem. Now, hydro has been a big part of the electricity system of this region. It has been rather flat for the last 10 years in terms of output, but it's delivering 50% of electrical energy. I have to remark that everyone looks at electricity thinking that's what energy is. On a global scale, only 18% of the world's energy is delivered through electricity. So being able to put renewable energy into our electricity markets is only a small part of the issue. And I think we've all got to appreciate that. Further electrification will happen across the world, but at a relatively slow pace. There's $55 trillion invested in infrastructure on our energy system on the planet today. Translating that, moving that is going to take decades. Gas is going to be an important role. Gas in this region is in the power sector. Gas is roughly equivalent to hydro in energy output, and gas will grow over the next 20 years in terms of the demand for gas in this region. And clearly there's not much coal, which is great. Actually, one of the key issues that faced around the developing world, particularly in Asia, is the growth of coal. But already Latin America has a small amount of coal in its power mix and its energy mix. But by far and away, the largest energy source that is used in Latin America today is oil. 37% of the total primary energy is oil. And that does show growth going forward. Demand is still growing for oil. And actually, if you look at the future, oil and gas, and actually renewable sources, such as the non-hydro renewable sources, will contribute similar amounts of additional supply over the next 20 years. So I think the non-hydro renewable growth will be stunning. Probably over 20 years, it will grow 3 times what it is today. But still, in that period, it will probably only be 9% of the total energy mix in 20 years' time. Now, clearly, we all have a pressing need to accelerate that growth. But what we can't forget is the vastness of the underpinning energy system and making sure that that is replenished and supplied adequately to support economies. Now, Latin America is also very interesting. It actually delivers more or less the amount of energy that it consumes. If you look at the total production of oil, gas, hydro, and consumption, they kind of balance. Now, if you don't grow oil and gas production in Latin America, the consumers will demand it. And because the consumers demand it, if you don't develop your own indigenous resources, you'll have to import oil and gas to satisfy that need. That is a reality, and that will not be good for the fiscal balances of the countries in the region. So I am concerned that there's a lot of rhetoric, which there should be, around non-hydro renewable growth, but we have to keep the supply of energy flowing. Colombia is a great example. It benefits enormously from its oil resources. 24% of the revenues to the government are from the oil resources. But its reserves need replenishment. That's why exploration here is something that Shell is engaged in, as they are in places like Trinidad or Bolivia or Uruguay or Argentina, and hopefully, but also Brazil, but hopefully then Mexico as well. So exploration remains quite important. But we also need to provide energy to the right places. So indigenous gas resources, such as in Bolivia, we have 1,500 people now doing seismic in the mountains of Bolivia. But also LNG. So we have a position in Peru LNG, Trinidad LNG. And LNG demand is increasing in the region. It's probably going to double in the next 5 years in terms of LNG demand. And that is to satisfy basically gas demand balances in the countries that are consuming gas for power in particular. But also oil. And, you know, the oil resources of Latin America, particularly in Venezuela, are clearly spectacular. And some of those are heavy oil resources, and whether they get developed, we'll have to see. But you also have some of the most prolific resources in the world, such as in the Santos Basin in Brazil. And Shell, through the BG acquisition, clearly has a very big position in the Santos Basin. But also in the shales resources of Argentina. Behind the US and Canada, Argentina is emerging as the next largest shale oil and gas potential in the world. Now, we're involved in oil, we're involved in gas. We're also involved in renewable sources of energy, and particularly bioethanol, with our joint venture with Cosan, the Raízen joint venture in Brazil, one of the largest biofuels producer in the world. And 13 of the 24 mills there are Bonsucro sustainable standards accredited. Now, that's a position we're proud of, and we've recently started up a second generation biofuels unit there to use the waste from the crop products, not the primary crop product, in order to deliver liquid fuels. All of these sources are going to be needed. Non-hydro is going to grow. It will grow significantly. The pace of solar technology development is stunning. But Shell's actually a bit under capital constraint at the moment, so we've promised the market to spend $25 to $30 billion a year in the next 5 years, down from what we were spending before. But the top 10 solar companies in the world last year spent $5 billion. That's the gap. None of them ever made a profit. None of them have ever given a dividend to shareholders. So the gap between where that emerging technology is and where it needs to get to in order to be in the real mainstream delivery of energy is still a long way, and we need to support and make sure it happens. So providing the world with more energy and less CO2 is not a simple case of turning off oil and gas companies and turning on renewable companies. It is a transition that will take decades. Shell is going in that journey. Shell is promoting and developing its gas resources, with 50% of production now gas versus oil. And recently also announced our own new energies division of Shell. But I think this is a transition that I think we'll all have to go in step to make sure that in that process, not only meet the obligations of the climate ambitions, but also that energy is supplied to the world's population to continue to help them grow and develop.
Thank you. I have a quick question for you. What is your view on the impact of the current oil prices? And I kind of asked Mr. Bulgheroni this earlier. And also, what are the lessons that I think Latin American players that are new to the upstream market that they can learn from your experience having dealt with this in other markets and in other trends before?
Yeah, clearly we're challenged, and as the upstream director in Shell, I'm in a little bit of an uncomfortable position now with the current oil price and how to actually reinvent a business around $50 instead of around $100. And for us, it means some radical changes. We're reducing costs. I mean, my business has taken $3.5 billion of costs out in the last 2 years, which actually means that we've had to say goodbye to a number of people. 12,500 across Shell announced in the last 12 months. So big changes to try and get ourselves basically leaner and meaner and fitter, and we do see enormous progress there. But also to develop new resources at the new reality of oil prices. And we see, again, enormous progress there. And as I say, we have a very big deep order position. And break-even prices, for instance, in the Santos Basin in Brazil, where Petrobras are operating, are now down around $40 or less. So today's oil price, you can actually make a return on your investment there, which is obviously clearly creating a new paradigm for us. But it's about getting very cost-effective operating costs, but also only going after the best resources in the best fiscal regimes. So for governments that require or would like their indigenous resources to be developed, creating a framework which allows the companies to develop them that is transparent, stable, and attractive is pretty crucial, because we're all cutting back on capital spend. And so I think it's this mixture of operating costs, development costs, but also being very careful in which jurisdictions you're spending your money.
Thank you. So we've looked at this from the renewable side, from the oil and gas side, from the foreign investor side, from climate change, social entrepreneur, and the general push for the collaboration of all of these together with a regional integration project and goals for the region on a long-term sustainable basis. With that, I'd like to open it up for questions that you may have for the panelists. And if you don't mind introducing yourself when you ask your question. Thank you very much.
Hello. I'm José de Sá, head of oil and gas for Bain & Company in South America. We heard from some of the panelists there is a glut in oil, global glut in oil, global glut in LNG. There is an increasing availability of LPG in the U.S. being dislocated by cheap natural gas from shale. There is a buildup of downstream capacity. And now we have the competitiveness of renewables like eolic and solar, like in Chile, where they won the last bids in the energy grid. That obviously presents opportunities and threats for Latin America, where we have countries in the region that are exporters of energy, export oil, but these same countries import derivatives as well. And there are countries that are also energy starved, like Chile. What do you view are the key opportunities and threats for the different countries in Latin America in this scenario, both for governments and for the private sector?
You want to take that?
Maybe I'll say a few words about Vaca Muerta, which is a hot topic and certainly is an opportunity. Clearly, Vaca Muerta is a tremendous resource. It's about give you the exact number, I have it here. It's about 44,000 square kilometers of resources, and it's about 4 trillion cubic meters of recoverable gas and about 20 billion barrels of recoverable oil. That is enough oil and gas to supply current consumption in Argentina for 40 and 50 years, respectively. So it's a big resource, and the resource is there. We know it's there. We also have I would say, a lot of the needed infrastructure, because the province in which Vaca Muerta is, which is Neuquén, within the Neuquén Basin, is an oil province and has been for the last 100 years. So there's been a lot of development in terms of infrastructure to provide that energy into the market, as well as there's a lot of consciousness within the government, both the provincial government and the federal government, of what kind of policies are needed to sustain, to promote and sustain that development. However, we're still early on the learning curve. A lot of the companies there, such as ourselves, are investing heavily, and we see a very bright future for the development of both gas and oil out of the Vaca Muerta resources. But we do need time to develop this resource. We need certainly a lot of additional capital. We need additional infrastructure. And above all, we need knowledge, because we do need to understand better how to best attack the development, the best strategy for the development of this resource in terms of productivity, in terms of the logistics. So I think one of the big opportunities, referencing the general state of the world markets, and in particular Latin America, is the unconventional resources in the Neuquén Basin.
Maybe can I perhaps add something to your question? And I think basically governments and companies have the same challenge. And they need to understand where is it that technology is driving things, what is the direction in which the whole global economy is going because of underlying technology changes, then assess what is their legacy infrastructure, what is it that they have coming from the past, and what of that makes sense in the next future and in the far future. How much you can change that to fit the new world, and how much you can just let it die, and how much you can have to just cut out because it stops you from getting there. And I think that's the most difficult part. How much of the legacy you have to kill for you to survive, that's the most difficult decision from a company standpoint. Typically, it is something that is always kind of postponed, but it needs to be carried on, and it needs to be handled up front. And governments, sometimes they kind of don't really, they're not really conscious about it. So good governments have a view of what the legacy is, what is it that they need to do, or try and push the society to do with it, because technology is going to affect it. How much you can change and how much you can throw away. I think that's a big change. That's a big discussion now.
So can I perhaps, can I just say, I think governments and companies have the same challenge, and that is, how on earth do we remain viable in a lower price world? And for resource-rich countries, that is a real issue if they've got used to enjoying much higher prices. But where I think it's a great opportunity for both those countries and the companies to reform, to be able to deal with the lower prices. You see Saudi Arabia with the enormous reforms that they're undergoing at the moment, using it as a catalyst for change. And certainly in Shell, we're doing that. But I think, can I just say, from a renewable standpoint, the demand for oil now looks like it's going up 1.5 million barrels a day this year again, and 1.6 last year. So product demand is going up as a result of lower prices and consumers consuming more. That's not necessarily, well, that's quite a good thing if you're delivering, but actually it means some of those surpluses will close. But it also raises the bar in terms of, the cost level that you're going to have to get renewables to perform in to compete. And I think those things in the mix, you have to look at that and make sure you end up with the right energy system. And for Shell, one of the core things that we would like to see is a global CO2 tax. Why do we say that? Because if you don't do that, you will get economic signals like you had in Germany with subsidies, that actually don't give you the result you're looking for. Only if that whole system values CO2 or penalizes CO2 will you get the energy system ultimately you're looking for. Otherwise, you'll get boom and bust in both sectors, which is not good for any of us.
We have time for one or two more questions, so maybe just for the time of efficiency, if we could ask the two. Ask a question.
Yes, hello. I'm Philippe de Knudde. I'm CEO of Latam for Engie. I have one question for Senor Starace. You talk about renewables, okay. You talk about the grid, which I agree is not a lot talked about, the modernization of transmission, of distribution. On the other hand, what I don't hear is about this trend to decentralizing energy. What is your opinion about that? Because it's a little bit contradictory with expanding grids.
Well, frankly, I think decentralization of, I guess, energy production, that's what you meant, is something that is going to happen anyway. Maybe I implied it, I was not explicit about it when I said that because of transmission line inherent inertia to respond, projects would be broken down into smaller ones and go at medium voltage and low voltage, and that's decentralization. And unless you digitize the networks, this decentralization cannot really go to a certain level. It stops at a certain point. So I think it is something that has to do also with the fact that in most societies, and I think this is happening also in Latin America, larger infrastructural projects are going to be more and more resisted, less and less sustainable because of impact on the environment and on consensus. So if you really want to drive these projects through, you need to really have people involved around them. And the more decentralized they are, the better. So it's a trend. It's not going to go away. It's going to continue. And I think it's something that requires, if you want to sustain it over the long term, a fully digitized system. Otherwise, it just stalls after a while. That was my point of view. Thanks.
Is there another question? I have a question.
Sure.
Okay.
No,
You go ahead.
I just...
So kind of lessons forward when we talk about the combination of the private sector, which I think, has been has had a consistent message, I think, for the government. In the next 5 years, if each of you could just give us your thoughts as to what you think will be accomplished in the current environment in Latin America. If you look back in the late 90s, there was a big push for regional collaboration, and then it stalled. Then alternative energy sources that were maybe not consistent with a regional collaboration were developed to meet the energy demands of the different countries. And now there's a general consensus again to go back and to a regional collaboration. But those projects that were developed in the interim, are almost adverse to that position. So kind of looking forward for the next 5 years, how successful do you think the region will be in accomplishing these tasks if you had a crystal ball?
If I can start that, I think it's a very, very large region. So I don't think you can dream that all of a sudden Latin America becomes a fully cooperative scheme on many things. What we think is going to be like a clusters. Central America is definitely a cluster that is finally coming to senses. And I think the big reforms that Mexico drove into the system catalyze around Mexico most of the action in terms of reform. And I think that's basically one big cluster. Then we think Brazil is in itself a continent, and I think it requires a lot of attention from a Brazilian standpoint, and it is a very well self-contained system, and it will probably be like that for the next 3, 4, 5 years. The Andean countries have an interesting game to play if they want. I mean, there is, in my opinion, most of the interplay at stake now. There is a lot of empty space in that region. How can Colombia, Peru, and Chile cooperate and coordinate their energy policies? That's a big, big open question. And I think in 5 years, they will probably be the most active part of this game. In Argentina, I think Argentina has a lot of work to do to go back into the real, let's say, economic cycle. So I think next couple of years, it would be a miracle, and I think it's happening. But I would bet that most of the cooperation will be between Argentina and the neighboring countries in order to re-establish links that existed before and that were severed during the Kirchner administration. And I think Argentina will probably be the biggest interplay of them all at this moment.
I'll take on your comment on Argentina, and I agree. I think that there's a lot of work to be done. We are not only living a political transition, but we're also living an economic transition in our energy sector, both on the generation on distribution of energy, but also on the oil and gas sector. And rather than what I can foresee, I would comment on what I would like to see, which is a slight difference, but I would certainly like to see the development of the resources in Vaca Muerta become, let's say, the barrels and the million BTU that replace the declining production that Argentina has today in the conventional. I also want to make I think it's worthwhile making a comment that there's a lot of territory that's been underexplored in Latin America, and we need a lot more exploration. For example, the offshore of the southern cone is almost unexplored, and we believe the same way we were all gladly surprised about the opening of the deep water offshore in Brazil. Who knows? We might find some surprises there. I think my third point is about cost, and I agree with Mr. Brown that living in a low price environment in a way is an opportunity for all of us, because it has waken us from this wonderful dream that anything could be done at the $100 price, $100 price, and in fact what happened was we woke up from a nightmare in which we found out that there were a lot of things we were investing on and paying for that were actually not needed. So it's an awakening that have forced us, and I welcome that forcing to redefine the way we do business, redefine the relationship we have with all our partners, whether it is as I said before, the governments, the trade unions, the service companies, and we are having that discussion. It's a tough discussion, but it's a discussion that needs to take place, and it's at the end. I'm not only convinced, but I have seen already the evidence that is good for everyone. It certainly is something that will bring more growth in the near term if we meet up the challenge of being profitable in this environment.
Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah. So I think the next 5 years brings great opportunities. I have to say that, but I believe it. And I don't think it's so much between countries, but actually countries reforming and attracting investment themselves. And I see clearly Argentina is making really positive progress. Colombia had its own opportunity reform, and actually that really delivered. I see really actual progress in Brazil in terms of opening up, particularly the pre-salt to international companies, but also in Mexico with their energy reform. So I think there has been a lot of progress, continues to be a lot of progress. Undoubtedly, I think Latin America will have challenges in meeting its energy demand. Undoubtedly, cross-border trade is going to be really important for that, and the connection of infrastructure is going to be important for that. But I think the most pressing thing is for the countries to create the right investment climate in order to take full benefit of the resources they have at their disposal.
Thank you. Renat, I'm so sorry, but do we have time for... We're over time, but one short comment.
Short comment. I believe that the future, the question to what degree Latin American countries are successful also depends to what degree are they willing and able to embrace the renewable future and to what degree they're going to block it. Let's face it, renewables have been competitive in spite of the low oil prices. Everybody would have thought, oh, low oil prices, now the business case is gone for renewables. No, it wasn't. So if the cycle, as you mentioned it, turns back and oil prices are higher, expect an even bigger push for renewables. So if you think renewables, think Uber, think iPhones, that could be the step change that we're having ahead of us. And maybe very last comment, if I may, a global tax on CO2 would of course be fantastic. That would be the most efficient policy instrument. Yet, until we get that, we may already be in a 6 degrees world because politically it's impossible to agree on it. So I just advise on the short term, let's face it, let's go with country by country legislation and let's ensure that governments learn from each other and create the most efficient laws and regulations that foster private sector investment and not block it.
Well, thank you all very much. And with that optimistic note, I think we call it a session. Thank you very, very much.